Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and we've heard this morning from Eddie a little bit about our work among the Kuya of Ivory Coast, and I just want to kind of take things on a stage further in the way that translation is done around the world today, and make a bit of a comparison too between the way we worked among the Kuya and the way I'm now working as a translation consultant, mainly in a project in Madagascar. So the Kuya situation, as Eddie explained, was in the rainforest of Ivory Coast, so it's a very rural situation. And the group I'm most involved with in Madagascar is called the Tandrui, who are a people group much, much larger, of around 500,000, and they are basically in the southern semi-arid part of Madagascar. You're probably familiar with the island of Madagascar, fourth largest island in the world, and its population of about 20 million, and off the east coast of Africa. And it's a very diverse island. You've probably heard about the various the animals and plants, and seen David Attenborough out there, no doubt. And we work with a group, around 13 languages on the island of Madagascar. And as I say, I'm mainly involved with a group called the Tandrui. In many ways, you can say they are also a marginalized group, as the Kuya were. The Kuya didn't have paper, as they said, and so they didn't feel that theirs was a proper language. It's a little bit different situation in Madagascar. Our working language, at least for me, is French. But I was really surprised the first time I went there, because a number of the translators didn't speak brilliant French, and they'd had most of their education in the official Malagasy language. So you might think, if there is an official language, official Malagasy language, why then do we need to do translation? In the 1990s, two Wycliffe workers from South Africa did language survey work throughout the island to look at how many languages there actually were, by doing research and talking to people and seeing just how much of the official language could be understood, but also comparing languages one to another and seeing whether they were different languages or dialects or what words you would use, but to do this scientifically. And they found that there were in fact more than 20 different forms of Malagasy languages. They're all related to each other. Their origins are from the original settlers of the island of around 500 AD, when people from Indonesia came and settled the island of Madagascar. And so the most closely related language today is in fact in Indonesia, the Manyang language. And so they're all related to one another, but the official language was the language of the dominant people group, which became the official language of the island. And so people would say, we are one island, there's only one language. But for many people around the island, as you can imagine, that's not their daily reality. So as in the Kuya situation, schooling was done in French, but in Madagascar, schooling is done mainly now in official Malagasy, but still for many people in the south of the island, in particular, and in the far north, to them the official Malagasy is in fact a foreign language. This is one of our Tandrui translators, and he says, as far as I'm concerned, before we had this translation work, Christianity for a Tandrui person meant becoming a foreigner, because God was the foreigner's God. So when someone became a Christian, their Tandrui customs were replaced by foreign customs. So it was the case that French and British missionaries brought the gospel to Madagascar a few hundred years ago, but even when people from the capital come using official Malagasy for the people, particularly in the south, even this is seen as a foreign message and is often rejected. So there has been a Bible in official Malagasy since 1835, but that's, in one way, that's an advantage that there is a Bible in a very closely related language. But on the other hand, it's also one of the issues, because often when the official language is used to proclaim the gospel, there is a lot of miscommunication going on. I can just give a couple of simple examples. In the official language, minu is the normal word that means believe, but in Tandrui and other southern languages, minu means to drink. It's just the normal everyday word for to drink. Heluke is official language for official Malagasy. It means guilty, but in Tandrui and in Bara, that means angry. So people might be apparently receiving the message, but they might be understanding something totally other. And that's been one of the biggest challenges, really, in this project that I'm involved in, because official Malagasy is being used as a means of communication within the different groups, but very often there are misunderstandings and there is a real need, and the churches have been asking for translation into the local languages. And some people say to me, what is, are we talking about dialects here, or are we talking about languages? But the language survey work has shown that some of the Malagasy languages are as different from each other as, say, Italian and Spanish. As you can imagine, a lot of similarities between those two languages, but lots of grammatical and other differences too. And it's the same in Madagascar. There are, as I say, more than 20 distinct languages. But we haven't really been talking about them as languages within this project, because it certainly, when the project began in around 2001, it was still pretty politically sensitive, because there was this message that there is only one language and everybody understands it. So we've been talking about different forms of Malagasy, and as we've been working with different teams. So I want to talk a little bit about the different ways of working. When Eddie and I were working among the Kuya, as he said, we were basically doing the hands-on translation. We were doing the exegesis. We were helping our co-workers to come up with terms that could be used in the translation. But we were basically there doing the work as part of the translation team. And then another consultant would come from the outside and check the work that we've been doing for accuracy. So now, in a sense, I'm at the other side of the translation table, and as a consultant, I'm trying to get alongside teams of local translators to help them check their work for accuracy against the original, and help them to solve translation problems. So this project was started by a limited goals project called the Luke Partnership, which brought together people from different churches around the island, from different missions that were working there, and asked the church to provide translators, people to be trained as translators, so that they will be translating into their own languages. And so this training took place in various workshops, where we would get a number of translation teams together and teach about translation principles and how to solve translation problems. And it was quite encouraging to be getting together with a group of translators from different parts of the island, and they were comparing notes with each other and learning together. So as a consultant, that's one of the main differences in the way that Wycliffe has changed the way it works now, is that rather than having expats work with doing the translation work with a team, rather we're in the role of trainers and consultants, so that local people can be trained to translate into their own languages, because they are the experts in their language essentially, and they're going to do a better job than foreigners. But so we've been organizing workshops to do that training, and then the translators were getting their first experience by working through translating the book of Luke, Gospel of Luke, and then also working on the Jesus film. So that was the original aim of the project, was for all the teams to complete Luke and the Jesus film. So this also gave an opportunity to see within the group of translators that the church has set aside, to see which of those translators really had got the necessary gifts and would keep on doing this work, and others maybe that wanted to bow out and say, oh, okay, well, I've worked on the Jesus film, I've worked on Luke, but I don't think translation is for me. And then, obviously, each team will work with a consultant. So I aim to go out to Madagascar for a visit, usually twice a year. So I'll be continuing the training of the teams as I work with them, and then also checking their work for accuracy together with them using French. The level of education of the people that we're working with is quite variable. In the particular team that I'm working with, I have, there are a couple of Catholic priests and a Lutheran pastor and retired teacher, retired civil servant, and they have varying levels of education, but certainly the priests have had 7 years of training in theology, in anthropology, in biblical languages, and so they're pretty well educated, probably got more theology than I have, and so it's great to be working with people who can really get to grips with the abstract concepts necessary, and to look at the different options they have for translating. But one of the big differences with this project is that we are working with volunteers. The situation with we had in the Kuya was that we were employing local people to work with us as co-translators, whereas in this particular project, for various reasons, we're asking the churches to provide people, and mainly they already have a full-time job, so it's quite challenging for them to find the time and to come together to get the time off work, or to make themselves available for this translation work between the workshops as well. So sometimes that's a real challenge in terms of, we were supposed to have this gospel prepared for checking and it's not ready, and I've booked my ticket, what are we going to do? So lots of logistical challenges like that. But as we've moved on in many of the teams beyond Luke and the Jesus film to doing other gospels, and some of the teams are looking to translate the whole New Testament. Others are doing portions of Old Testament and New Testament, or lectionaries, but it's still quite challenging for them to find the time to devote to the translation work. But basically, it's the same process, because all the steps that Eddie talked about, you need to do the exegesis, you need to do the drafting, then the text that you've produced needs to be shared among the community to see what people understand, and then it needs to go through the process of checking with a consultant for accuracy, that same process is still in place. That's what's required for a good quality translation. And so that doesn't change, but the ways of achieving that to some extent have changed. And also the challenges of this particular languages when it comes to the process of translation are also the same, because Eddie was talking about not having a word for anchor among the Kuya. Well, the challenges are different among the Malagasy, but they're still there. One of the issues I think I face is that whereas among the Kuya, the vocabulary in some areas was really quite limited, one of the issues is among the Tandrui is that they seem to have a very, very rich vocabulary. And so sometimes it's not a question of, we don't have a word for that, we're going to have to find a way around it. Sometimes they have like 4 or 5 different words, and the question is, which is the most appropriate? One of the issues when I was working with a different team, the Bara, we were discussing what word they could use to translate forgiveness. And it was particularly when Jesus on the cross says, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing." There's real deep forgiveness. And the team was suggesting to me, we've got this word, that means that if I do something wrong today, you forgive me, but then, if I do it again tomorrow, that's fine. And they had about 4 or 5 different words for forgiveness, and one was, it was just really difficult to get them to give examples and to come up with which was the most appropriate word for forgiveness. And eventually the expression they came up with, which they thought was most appropriate, was, "My stomach is clean for you." And that's when you're not going to bring up the issue again tomorrow. You have really, truly forgiven. And so that's the expression that they used in Luke. And as Derek was talking this morning about thinking theologically and living theologically, I believe very much that when the teams are choosing these key theological terms in the Bible, they are actually doing theology on the ground. How the words that they choose for terms such as forgiveness and righteousness actually are going to colour how the gospel is received in that culture. And so it's vitally important that they understand the biblical concept and that they are guided and helped to choose the most appropriate terms. There was one in one particular language, the term that was chosen for sin, for example, was just the same word as that you would use for a spelling mistake. So my mistakes have been forgiven. That's one thing, but to talk about sin like that just didn't get the biblical concept of what sin is. And so that's one of the biggest challenges, however, whoever's doing the translation. So those discussions can go on for hours and hours. But eventually, we're just so aware when I go and work with a team. Just recently I was there for a couple of weeks and we were working on the Epistle of Galatians. And there are some really tricky verses in there and we were really struggling. But at the same time, we were also very aware of the Spirit's help. You just can't do this work without the help and inspiration of the Spirit to guide you to good solutions when you come across translation problems. One of the challenges in Malagasy languages also is that there are 2 ways of talking about we, second person plural. Sorry, first person plural, we. So I can talk about we. Eddie and I are going back home to Yorkshire later today, and I could use the word anai which just refers to me but doesn't include you. Or I can use a word, we are talking about Bible translation today, and include you all, and I would use a different word. I would use ntsika. So it's an I and ntsika, and that's in all of the languages in Malagasy. It's in many other languages around the world, which makes this distinction. And as we found working through Galatians, that really became an issue, which to talk to, was it an inclusive we that Paul was using, or was it an exclusive, just him and the, who the letter was from? For example, if he uses one word, then he was just talking about we, as in we Jews. But if he was using the ntsika word, then he would be including the Galatians as well in what he was talking about. And sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. But the thing is, in the Greek, there is not that distinction. In the English, in the French, does not make that distinction. And so you have to actually choose, you have to make a theological decision. What is Paul talking about here? Which verb do we use? Now, in many instances, the people use that in their own language without thinking about it. It's just automatic. But in a letter like Galatians, for example, it becomes very important. And in fact, if they use the wrong one, it's hard. It makes the passage hard to understand, and it's just not accurate. So that's one of the challenges. Another of the challenges in this team is that they are, I think, the only language on the island which has kind of two sets of verbs and nouns, depending on how much respect you have to show to the person you're referring to. So, for instance, we can just talk about a house, my house in the village, Tranu, but if you're talking about the house of God, you have to use a different word, Anzumba. And so with the different relationships between Jesus and the disciples, and in certain contexts, we have to, again, make a theological decision. Should we use the word here to refer to Jesus? For example, when Jesus is at the wedding in Cana, and Mary tells the servants to go and do whatever Jesus tells you to do. Which set of terms should we employ there? As referring to her son, then she would normally use verbs and nouns which showed kind of less respect. But did Mary at that point know who Jesus really was? Should she be using terms which showed more respect in reference to Jesus? And so, again, these are theological decisions that you have to make, and obviously the Western commentaries don't have anything to say about these issues. Fortunately, we do have, there are translation guides and helps which highlight some of these issues that we can use, but not all of them. Eddie talked a little bit about technology and the helps we have here. You've got, we have this wonderful program called Paratext, which was developed jointly between Wycliffe and Bible societies, specifically for those involved in translation. And as you can see there, we can have lots of different French versions up on the screen, the language that I'm working on, a word-for-word sort of back translation, and the Greek, all on the screen at the same time, and you can make searches so you can see how you've translated, for example, righteousness in different contexts, and have you been consistent, and also lots of tools for helping you check that you have got all the chapters and verses in each book, and that you have got that you have been consistent in the way you've been spelling words as well as in the way you've been translating. So that's a wonderful help. Another of the differences in the ways of working is when it comes to funding as well. Eddie and I, as members of Wycliffe Bible Translators, we need to raise our own financial support, and when we were working in Ivory Coast, we were also responsible for all the expenses of the Kuya project. So we were paying salaries, we were buying paper, computers or whatever, whereas the project in Madagascar is funded from outside, from an affiliate of Wycliffe Bible Translators US, and so that means that it's possible for me as a consultant to be funded in this project to fly out to Madagascar twice a year, because under the system there's no way we could have funded that kind of thing. And so that makes a different way of working possible, where we gather the groups of translators together for workshops. Again, they need feeding and housing and all that kind of thing is paid for by outside funding, basically. Another difference really is that the outputs are different in this project. Whereas we were very focused among the Kuya in producing a written translation, the initial focus in this project in Madagascar was to work on Luke's Gospel and produce the Jesus film, and then also to do an audio edition of Luke's Gospel. I mentioned at first that it's actually slightly sensitive to talk about other languages in Madagascar other than the official language. And one of the problems was that an organization who you would have expected to be one of our main partners in producing scriptures in the different languages of the island, actually were not happy about the prospect of us producing written materials in the different forms of Malagasy, because they're saying, no, the written Malagasy is for the official language. These local dialects forms, they shouldn't have a written form. So that was quite an obstacle at first, and I think attitudes have been slowly changing, though it's still somewhat sensitive, but more and more people are seeing the need for these languages, the different languages in Madagascar, to have translations, and also with the prospect of us not being allowed to produce written gospels, the church has said, no, this is our language, we are going to print written versions, and so they did. But it is still slightly sensitive. So we've now produced the Jesus film in 10 different languages, and we have started working now in 3 other new languages. So that's another big difference, in that if you're expats working with one team, then your capacity is limited, whereas as consultants we can work with a number of teams, because the teams are doing the work on the ground and the consultants are coming in to do the checking work. So there is more capacity because you're training the local people to do the work. So we have gone on to produce written versions of Gospels, printed versions, and also we try and also do an audio version, because there are still many people that don't read official language or don't read their own language either. And so it's been great to have an ethnomusicologist work with some of the teams and help them to produce songs from the words of Scripture. And so along with the audio, we try and produce a number of local songs as well, and people are just loving those. Sell like hotcakes. This is also another way of, oh, it's a bit dark. getting people to hear the Gospels when they're translated is this thing called a radio carte, and it's a little SD card that goes into a radio, which can also be used as an ordinary radio, and people can listen to the scriptures like that, and that's proving very popular as well, because we want these scriptures to be out there for everybody. And just a little bit about the impact. The Jesus film has been very popular in the languages where it is now available, and I worked with the Bara team on Luke's Gospel and doing the Jesus film, and I was hearing a number of months after the film was available that people were so delighted to have something in their own language. It was the first film ever produced in this language, and people were very proud of that, having a film in their own language. And there was some local, how would you call them? Umbiasa is kind of a spiritual shaman, medium, that was watching the film in Bara, and afterwards went to speak to one of the pastors, because this shaman had seen the power of Jesus through the film and thought, I am powerful, but I don't have power like that, and wanted to know more about who Jesus was, and actually did become a Christian. And again, one of the members of our Tandrawi team said that before, when people preached in official Malagasy, it didn't make sense because the words had a different meaning in our language. But now, with this translation work, the message is clear and it's relevant to Tandrawi people. So again, it's the need for it, even if people who are educated and understand the official Malagasy language, for them it just means so much more to hear the scripture in their own language, and the understanding is greater too. When the Tandrawi film was first shown by one of the churches in the south, afterwards, oh no, it wasn't the film, it was the team were out trying to test their translation in the community. They were trying to see what people understood of their translation, to see if they needed to make any changes, anything that wasn't clear. And after they'd finished reading out portions of the gospel, a teacher, history and geography teacher, came up to them at the end and said, who wrote this? You know, what you were reading out, who wrote this? Because it sounds like something that really happened. You know, so that was the difference, to hearing it in his own language. He thought, the way it's written, the way it's told, it sounds like something that really happened. Whereas it hadn't, obviously, if he'd heard that in the official language, it hadn't had that same impact on him. So, just a few reflections. I think one of the things that obviously makes a difference, as I've mentioned just now, is the funding, because this is funded from outside. It means that it's possible for us to work in this way, flying consultants in. On the other hand, that's not ideal, and the interest in the churches being involved and making their contribution to funding of the work going on there is perhaps stifled by all the funding just coming in from outside. So I think we need a conversation really about how mission work like this is funded, and different ways of collaborating with partners on the ground, because at the moment I don't know that there's a lot of dialogue in both directions. And I think that's something we really need to think about in terms of projects being viable but also in terms of people owning the work and valuing it and contributing, making their contribution as well. In some ways, perhaps the local contribution has been pushed out. We did have one of the churches involved in the partnership project, the Malagasy Lutheran Church, was contributing in some way by paying the salary of a pastor involved in translation, so that they would pay the salary whether he was doing church work or whether he was doing translation work. So that's a start. That's one way of this collaboration being able to happen, but it didn't work out brilliantly, and he didn't end up spending much of his time actually doing translation. So there's potential there, but I think it needs exploring more. Another issue, perhaps something that's changed since we were working among the Kuya, has been that there's a lot more awareness of oral communities and different ways of reaching people from oral communities with the gospel, of doing Bible storying, of doing even oral translation. And that's something that's ongoing, and again, that's a big difference to the way we thought of what we were working towards, and there's now much more emphasis on audio, on different methods of hearing the gospel, not just reading and writing. Again, very much the change of expats and mother tongue speakers has changed over the years, and now I would say that the vast majority of translation projects around the world are led by mother tongue translators. As Eddie was talking about setting up a course for local people to be trained, that is going on more and more in different countries, and it's great to see that we're collaborating in different ways, and local people are having more, the initiatives are more in their hands now, which is good. Being in that consultant role as an expat actually is not always comfortable, because technically I'm the one who says, okay, yes, this translation is accurate, and I believe that this is now ready to be published, but I'm a Westerner and this is not my language, and yeah, at times when I'm doing the consultant checking, working with the team, it's not a comfortable place to be, because we're very aware of, certainly one of the translators is very aware of colonial issues and what that felt like to be, and how he views people of my colour, as it were. And I want it to be a good quality translation, but I don't want to be the one that says saying it this way is more accurate than saying it that way. So it's a difficult line to walk, really. And also we want the translation to be acceptable by all the different churches, and I'm working with a team which is mixed Catholic and Protestant, and again, sometimes walking that line of getting something that we can all agree on and which is accurate and representative of the original text is often a challenge, because we have different ways of viewing scripture. But I think very much what I seek to do as a consultant is not to be like the teacher coming in with a red pen and saying, yes, this is good, this is bad, but rather coming with the gifts and experience that I have, coming alongside a team of people who are well qualified and they have their experience and their gifts, and we all come to the table to work together with the help of the Spirit to produce a translation which is of good quality. And I think, to me, it's not just about producing an end product, a translation or whatever. I think what is even more important is the way we work together and the way we listen and understand one another. That's far more important than producing a perfect translation, which nobody ever does. But it's the way we work together, the way we show love, the way we reflect God's glory, which is the most important thing. And this work, the team I'm working with at the moment, they are getting on in years, as we are, but really this work is being done for the next generation and those generations to come. Eddie was saying earlier he didn't think the Kuya New Testament would ever be revised. The official Malagasy version has been revised a number of times, but again, I don't know about what will happen in the future with the languages we're translating into now, but it's for these next generations, and we want them to have access to the scriptures in a way that their parents and grandparents never did. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Does anyone have any questions for Sue?
Or for
and
both.
For that matter, for Eddie? It can be a joint response. Any questions at this stage?
Yeah.
Ken?
Thank you for that. The resistance to translating to other dialects or sub-languages, is that based primarily on sort of form things in terms of it would be loath to produce a copy of the scriptures in Glaswegian, for example? Or is it politically based because of issues of political instability within the country?
So perhaps we can just repeat. So the question would be, is the reluctance to translate into certain dialects a practical issue just because of numbers, or is it a politically motivated issue?
I would say the resistance that we've experienced at the beginning was certainly there was a political motivation. It was a politically sensitive subject. Basically, the government was saying there is one Malagasy language, so I would think it was largely political. And also, yes, sociolinguistic attitudes. Certainly the people in the south, from the Bara or the Tandrui, they see even the official Malagasy language as a foreign language. So there's a psychological thing there. And one of the interesting things about bringing people together and starting this translation work, people have often been taught by the church that the only proper church language is official Malagasy. And so the churches have to some extent perpetuated that, particularly on the plateau, in the capital and in the central area of the country. And so people, if they would try and pray in their own language, they would get put down and told, no, you've got to use proper language in church. And so that's something which is so deeply ingrained in people, it's been very difficult for them to sort of break free of it. And so for people to come to workshops where they're encouraged to express themselves in these languages, it's been amazing to see. People have just felt so liberated when they realize, I can talk to God in my language, because that just wasn't a possibility for them before. So I think it's been partly political, but also socio-linguistic, in that, I suppose, the so-called dominant language group, which became the official language, and so people feel alienated from that. And but the churches having kind of pushed the official language, then it's been difficult for people to see their language as valid and to see that they can use it to pray in and to translate scripture into.
Any other questions at this stage? Yes.
I was particularly interested in your theological decision making, particularly whenever you think about we and relations.
Yeah.
Is there a mechanism by which some of that theological decision making can come back to people like ourselves that sometimes have a very fixed perception of our theology?
Yes.
These discussions actually can help shape our theology and the theological transformation here.
If you've got any ideas of how that could happen, I will be delighted, because I think that is something that people need to hear. And we talk about theology, and then we talk about African theology and Asian theology, and actually, that also speaks volumes, the way we talk about it. But in terms of choosing biblical terms and the choices which are there for certain languages because of the nature of the language, which doesn't exist in English. I mean, if you think about, just reflect on the second person plural, you, and singular. We just don't differentiate at all in the English language anymore. And so very often you can read through an epistle and you can read the yous in your head in the singular, when actually, if you go back to the Greek or whatever, you can see, oh, it was in the plural, and we have to be doubly careful in English because we don't differentiate. But certainly, I think it does have something to add to us. And I think also, yes, it's important to have translations in these different languages around the world so that people can understand, so that people can know that this scripture is also for them, for their heart language. But also, there are, in each, as scriptures are translated into a new language, there will be nuances about the character of God, about how the gospel comes into that language that aren't there in other languages. And I think we are declaring God's glory in new ways as the gospel goes into other languages. And I think, again, that's a theological truth that we can all learn from.
Sue, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and for also responding to the questions. I'd like us to move into our time of prayer together, but perhaps if you do have further questions, either for Eddie or for Sue, keep them in mind, and if you can catch them for a few moments later on, just have a word with them. But thank you very much indeed. Are you hooked?
Stuck, I'm hooked.
Yeah, right there. Thank you very much.